Next, we'll begin to talk about schizophrenia and schizophrenia spectrum disorders. Schizophrenia spectrum disorders are this continuum of long-lasting psychotic disorders. Schizophrenia is really a grab bag category. It's used as a label for a number of different symptoms that sometimes go together, sometimes do not. But this label is given to a person who may experience some and not others, or all of them at the same time. So it's a spectrum, a collection of these psychotic disorders. I'll make a note, this is not multiple personalities. That is something called dissociative identity disorder, when somebody may, in one moment, genuinely feel like they are a certain personality, have a certain identity, and then in another moment, embody an entirely different identity or person. That's dissociative identity disorder. It's not schizophrenia. This is a common mistake. So, what are psychotic disorders then? It is an inability to distinguish reality from fantasy. It is an inability to tell the difference between what's actually happening in front of you and perhaps what you believe is happening. Reality versus fantasy. And so it often involves some amount of disturbance in thinking, emotions, behavior, perception. Again, tons of different kinds of symptoms associated with schizophrenia spectrum disorders. I want to go through a few of these symptoms. Because it is defined by an inability to distinguish reality from fantasy, the most common, most well-known symptoms are these here: delusions, hallucinations, and then flat affect. Delusions probably sound very similar to two other things that we've gone over: illusions and hallucinations. Delusions, though, are less about something that you see or a sensation that you're experiencing, and more about a belief that you hold. So if a hallucination is perceiving something that is not there, a delusion is believing something that is not true. So a fixed false belief. And there are many different types of delusions. I'm going to highlight three here. A delusion of persecution would be the belief that there is somebody or a group of people out there who is hell-bent or who are hell-bent on disrupting your life, making your life worse in some way. This is a delusion that you can often experience if, say, you are in a situation where you have actually been persecuted by someone or a group of people, or your life has been controlled by someone, maybe an extremely overbearing parent or a partner who is a romantic partner who has controlled your behavior. This is something that you could learn over time, that there are people out there who wish to control me. And so, at any given moment, someone out there might be trying to control me. This is, I think, a delusion that may be becoming more popular as social media becomes more advanced, because you can kind of get this uncanny feeling like when you're being advertised to, and they're actually showing you ads that they shouldn't know. You to your partner the other day, you talked about how you were really looking forward to Tyson chicken nuggets, right? And then that same day, you then get an ad on Facebook or an ad on Twitter or wherever for Tyson chicken nuggets. It can feel like someone out there is watching you. Someone out there might actually be trying to control your behavior in some way. So my suspicion here is that perhaps these delusions are becoming more common as there is actual data being collected about people. What's often the case, though, with large data collection networks like social media is that data cannot actually be seen by any individual. Rather, it's being processed by an algorithm, by a computer formula that then just takes your data and then shows you an ad based on that data. No one's actually making the decision to show you that data. It's the consequence of a computer. Either way, it can certainly give you this feeling that other people are watching you. There are delusions of reference. These are very interesting. This is that feeling of, oh, I think someone is talking about me. Or rather, if it's a true delusion, you know someone is talking about you, even when they may not be. This is probably a feeling naturally you get if you are, say, at a party and you look over and someone is in a conversation and maybe they look over at you for just a second and then they go back to talking to the person that they're talking to. You might get the feeling of, well, they just looked at me. Are they talking about me? Are they referencing me? That's a totally natural feeling. This would be a delusion of this magnitude would be if you are absolutely convinced that in a situation where someone could not be talking about you, they actually are. A good example of this would be, especially among older individuals who sometimes can start to experience some symptoms of dementia that look like an inability to tell the difference between fantasy and reality. If they're sitting, they're watching TV, and the news anchor person says something that eerily seems like it's talking specifically about you, the person viewing. And then you then believe that that person, the news anchor, is actually talking directly to you. That is a delusion of reference, a delusion that someone is talking about you or referencing you. A delusion of grandeur. This would be the belief that you are more important, more grand than most other people. Now, funnily enough, in a modern age, I think most people already believe this to a lesser degree. And this is also called something called narcissism, that is having an inflated sense of self-worth. But this is the belief, a delusion of grandeur would be, if you genuinely believe that you are of a higher quality, you are made of stuff that no one else is made of, that you are somehow superior than other people, and that not only are you superior, but if that people don't treat you that way, then you can get extremely angry at them. That they should be treating you like God's chosen representative on earth, that you are kind of this magnificent individual. If they don't treat you that way, then there's an extreme reaction to that. That would be a delusion of grandeur, believing that you are better than you actually are, that you're more unique, more capable than you probably actually are. These are delusions, a certain type of inability to tell the difference between reality and fantasy. We also have hallucinations, which I've already talked about in a previous chapter, perceiving sensations that are not really there. This is things like hearing voices or seeing things, right? Seeing that there's a pink elephant next to you when there's actually nothing there, or hearing voices when there is no one speaking. These would all be types of hallucinations. And then flat affect, it's a little bit different, but it is a disturbance in styles of thinking. This is feeling or showing little to no emotion. People who experience flat affect, they can seem like they are absolutely disconnected with you, that they may be actually living in an entirely different kind of, they're living somewhere else. Their mind is so disconnected from you and what's happening in front of them that they are just non-responsive. A term that refers to this is catatonia. There's often, if you watch any movies where there's they're portraying a mental ward, there might be one person who's sitting in a chair, looking out a window, not moving, not making any expression, just sitting there. And if you try to interact with them, they don't interact back. If you try to get them to eat, they don't really want to eat. Or they not only do they not want to, but they won't. So they just don't respond at all. And they may not get up and go seek out food as someone normally would. That's catatonia. So it's this extreme feeling or showing little or no emotion or any responsivity to what's going on in the outside world. So what we can do is we can take these symptoms and we can classify them into two general categories: positive and negative symptoms. Positive is referring to the fact that when these symptoms show up, it seems like you're adding something a little bit extra that was not there before. So you're adding an ability that exceeds normal functioning. When you have a delusion, what you're doing is you have a belief about something that normally would not be there for most people. You would not feel that you are, God's chosen child, or that a news anchor is referring to you. You're adding something extra. Same with a hallucination. You're adding a perception that is not actually there. These are positive symptoms. Negative symptoms means that you're taking away a normal function. You're lacking something that you would normally have. For example, flat affect would be you are not responding to people outside of you as you normally would. You're not expressing emotions that you normally would have. People with schizophrenia, depending on the type of schizophrenia, may experience some amount of poor attention and inability to focus on what's in front of them, and also disorganized thinking, where as they attempt to express a thought or they attempt to communicate with people around them or talk, as they talk, their words may actually come out all garbled, incomprehensible. They don't make sense. That would be disorganized thought. So what is the etiology of these schizophrenia spectrum disorders? The biological model is by far the most influential. It seems to be the biggest explanation. First, there are prenatal influences. Prenatal meaning before birth. Turns out viral infections, certain types of viral infections while the mother is pregnant, are associated with the development of schizophrenia. So again, this would be a developmental contribution. As the child is developing in the womb, as the nervous system is being created, this virus can disrupt that development. Brain inflammation can be a big problem. Often with delusions, hallucinations, with those positive symptoms, if your brain, for some reason, becomes inflamed, which can be caused by a viral infection or certain types of bacterial infections, if the brain is inflamed, the skull is going to be putting pressure on the brain in ways that it would not normally put pressure. And when you put that pressure, it can actually create the perception of a hallucination. It can create the perception of something that is not actually there. There are neurochemical influences as well, neurotransmitter imbalances. I mentioned L-DOPA a long time ago when we talked about dopamine. This is an artificial type of dopamine that you can give someone. It's usually used for Parkinson's disease, which is when you have a deficiency of dopamine, you lose control of your fine motor movement. That is, your hands will start to shake. You might not be able to hold a pencil as you normally would. Well, L-DOPA is something that increases dopamine, and one of the side effects of L-DOPA is, especially if you take too much, is that you can start to hallucinate. You can start to have these delusional beliefs you otherwise wouldn't have. What antipsychotic drugs do, the drugs they give people with schizophrenia, is they reduce levels of dopamine, usually causing them to no longer hallucinate. But another side effect of that is, if dopamine is the neurotransmitter that is responsible for your feeling of pleasure, then these individuals may feel far less pleasure than they're used to feeling. And so they may stop taking their medication to feel happy again, to experience that pleasure. There are also contributions of brain structure abnormalities. Often there's a reduction in brain matter. So just the overall concentration of various types of neurons within the brain tends to decrease. And this is not something that I've focused on throughout this class, but there is a difference between what's called gray matter and white matter. Gray matter are made up of these relatively small, kind of packed, clustered together neurons. White matter tends to be neurons with lots of that myelin sheath, the sheath that helps with conducting the electrical signal. What you see here is often there's a reduction in that gray brain matter, specifically in the ventricles. So the ventricles are these spaces within the brain where there's fluid that helps lubricate and help keep the spinal column functioning normally. What you see is that those ventricles are larger, and no one's exactly sure why that contributes to schizophrenia, but it's pretty consistent. This is one of the most consistent brain abnormalities that you will see within people who have schizophrenia. Finally, we know that there are genetic contributions, and we know this through twin studies. If you look at the probability of someone developing schizophrenia, as the degree of relatedness with someone with schizophrenia increases, so too does the chance of you yourself being diagnosed with schizophrenia. So within the general population, you have about a 1% chance of developing schizophrenia. But as people become more genetically related, first cousins, uncles, aunts, nephews, nieces, grandchildren, you can see as we go down this list, as genetic similarity increases, so does the chance of being diagnosed with schizophrenia. Such that if you have monozygotic twins, that is, identical twins, they came from the same zygote being split early in development. If your twin has schizophrenia, you have about a 50% chance of you yourself also developing schizophrenia. So there is a very strong genetic component to this. One other detail I'd like to mention is that often with something like schizophrenia, there may need to be an activation of the genes that code for it. So just because you have the genes does not mean that you're actually going to develop that psychological disorder. The diathesis stress model stipulates that for many disorders, including schizophrenia especially, there needs to be an environmental stress that activates those genes. Often this can be a traumatic or stressful experience. So that is, undergoing some kind of physical or sexual assault, or being in a situation where you are, say, deprived of something that you need, nutrients or interaction with other people, some kind of extremely stressful event. That stress then leads to the activation of these genes. That's the diathesis stress model. Okay. That concludes this section on psychological disorders. Again, I encourage you, if you have questions about any of these disorders, let's please bring them up in the next class, next discussion, and we'll talk about it.